Well, hello everyone. We're on our third set of information relative to the conditions around an FDA investigation visit. And of course, the title for this one is Work in an FDA Response, Now What? My name is Walt Murray. I am the CEO and managing partner of ARC Experts, and we provide the quality and compliance consulting for MasterControl Incorporated. So as we look at the agenda for moving forward, I'm going to very quickly cover these bullets and then we'll get into each one of them. First is how do we go about organizing internally relative to the response and commitments for a response? Second is what is the process for the actions to be taken when we open either a CAP for an audit or we actually formally do CAPA level responses for an audit like this. Assigning the resources that are appropriate to engage in the response for each of the 43s or items that are in the response from the FDA. Writing herd on the resources. This is all about herding cats for sure, and we want to talk a little bit about that. Reporting back to the FDA timeline and updates that should be commensurate with the investigation that has been replied to. Let's talk a little bit about resolution relative to verification of effectiveness. How serious were the findings, and then commensurate to that, what am I looking for, what are my risks, and how do I address them? And then, of course, how to engage appropriately for those more serious issues in terms of resources, application, and closure. And then, of course, what the FDA looks for when they return or if they return ultimately for a follow-up investigation. So let's talk about the internal organization. We've given an initial 15-day response that we respect and will follow through on all the items according to the request of the FDA, and maybe some initial timeline issues relative to that. And of course, there may be some items that you have already followed up on for closure that will be in the 15-day response to see if the satisfaction of those is in order. And then, of course, some initial prospectus around what you are expecting to accomplish in terms of the order of magnitude of the investigation. So, of course, part of that is looking at a response team internally as to how you're going to handle making sure that you have the appropriate response. And in doing that, you first need to define what are the responsibilities specifically in terms of the response from a project management standpoint, and also from an analysis standpoint in terms of where you are current state to future state with regard to the request by the FDA. Now, that may require, of course, opening corrective and preventive action for each appropriate condition under which the FDA is looking for a response. But I would note the caveat here that a CAPA, of course, or corrective preventive action, means that you have something that's serious enough to have an formal investigation in verifying root cause or root causes, and then going through a formal validation of actions to be taken with the appropriate monitoring for effectiveness as part of that. And does the issue that you are dealing with need the merit of a CAPA, or does it possibly need something not as significant as a CAPA in terms of process, but a way to, for instance, perform a correction and not necessarily an action that would require a formal verification. Who will be doing the task assignments as far as the project is concerned relative to the leadership within the project? And then what will the tasks actually include? So you'll have task development, task verification and execution, and then of course you'll have closure verification relative to the process, okay? And so it's important to look at the responsibilities from the standpoint of the team in order for those tasks to be executed. So it's important for us to determine the resources for the actions to be taken, whether they be correction level oriented or corrective action level oriented or preventive action level oriented. Okay. Setting up the team and the leaders, you could have a higher level team with sub teams for the whole project. That person who may be at the highest level may be a organization. You need to be a reporting person in the management team, such as a director level individual who has the responsibilities around regulatory and quality affairs. And then underneath that, the appropriate people in your organization who can execute on each project relative to their expertise and their talent in effectively making this happen. So obviously there's a project plan, a preparation to look at how to map the way in which this is going to occur, what's going to occur, who's going to do it, what external or internal resources are necessary to do it, and then, of course, when you kick off and execute the plan accordingly. So first step in all of this, of course, is to have a meeting with the resource team. That resource team is typically made up of management, executive management, and or middle management. And that team is there to make sure that in the decision-making around the resource team that the appropriate criteria are being used for that process. Those criteria, of course, would include, as far as who it is, what the constraints of the project may be, what the restraints relative to the team members may be in their competition with other issues in the organization, the actual requirements to be applied and implemented, and then, of course, what the regulatory stipulations are and what we're looking at in terms of risk, which of course has the impact on who and how much should be done. Set expectations on the nature of the feedback, how often that will occur, who will give that feedback, what will be the nature of that feedback. Will you have for instance, a formal project planning device that may include, say, a one-page project manager type orientation, where you can relate major objectives all the way through to translate through to the timeline, and then risks in that timeline that occur on the basis of distractions or competitive issues, etc. Determine when the reporting should occur in terms of the provisions that you give the FDA what they're looking for. And of course, gather feedback on a timely manner. Make sure that relative to the organizational component of this, that you have the reporting spelled out specifically and the timing associated with that reporting and the manner in which it will be reported. And then, of course, what will be the project management around the preparation for the reports to be given to the FDA. Could include peer review considerations before ultimately sending that final document. And of course, make sure the project plan is updated, which brings me back to that the kind of one-page project manager or OPPM type document that has the timeline sliding across the calendar, and then in that way looking possibly at a vertical evaluation of things being on time, late, early, whatever the case may be, and then some assessment relative to risk with regard to that plan. So let's talk a little bit about the venue in terms of how we actually address the issues. First of all, determine the nature in which the action to be taken relative to the evaluation is managed. And here we typically have a tertiary escalation process. And that escalation process is reflected in the lower right-hand corner with the flow diagram you see there, where first we make sure that we have the appropriate understanding of the nature of the finding and how it will be addressed based on the channel it's coming from. Is it coming from the customer? Is it coming from a supplier? Is it coming from an internal manufacturing area? Is it coming from an administrative condition? Where's it coming from? And then immediately, how will the issue be looked at from a risk perspective in order to understand the nature of its escalation based on how much information should be gathered and the context in which it should be given. There could be one item with multiple CAPAs, or there could be multiple items with one CAPA. The association, of course, would be important for you to help the FDA understand the level of integration of your system based on how you manage the actions that you take in the collection of data, the correction or corrective action that needs to be taken, and then of course what supports that, whether it be just an issue review level condition or whether it actually be a full-blown root cause investigation. How will such action items be assigned? I think the assignment is clear if you understand the relative tasks to be orchestrated in an integrated fashion, and that should drive what you're looking at in terms of those resources commensurate to risk. Now, I'm going to speak in just a moment about that. Who will monitor the progress of the actions to be taken in their closure? This should be something that is looked at in terms of, is it the process owner, or is it a systematic condition under which there are several process owners? Again, is the level of correction related, or is it corrective action related? Okay. Ensure actions are performed in a timely manner. It's imperative that the nature of the timing around what's done, that the FDA be aware of what those timely actions are, the nature of the information to be provided, and how it will satisfy the infraction for effectiveness. Will there be preventive actions either initially as a result of dealing with an issue, or will it be a preventive action as a result of the corrective actions taken around an issue? So that relationship needs to be understood. Preventive actions, of course, in their own right are things that are future state, but can be defined in terms of like control measures based on risk, can be actions relative to construction or development of additional procedural conditions or process conditions. These are the type of things that should show the FDA that you're going to be thorough and effective. So task assignments. Of course, the initial person who is the project leader, typically a person who's going to report into the executive management team, and then of course that versus say any individuals who may be CAPA owners or situation or issue owners. It's important that it be clear as to who's going to manage the tasks relative to typically the middle management team, but it can be at the supervisory level, or in the case of looking at the external conditions, could be through a quality designated component of the organization where you're looking at stressing the agreement relationship and how certain things develop around the reporting mechanisms, which may be part of the actual action or answer taken relative to the infraction. Again, reporting on progress. This should be a very specific relationship-driven condition for assignment purposes as part of the calendaring events that take place during the period of time in which a corrective action is taken. And then, of course, the responsibility and authority should be very clearly delineated. Using a responsibility matrix is typically a good way to do that. Having sets and subsets of objectives, sub-objectives around the activation and the tasks to be managed, and then right there having the responsibilities spelled out per activity. Training. And understanding, people need to understand literally how they respond to these kind of things. And know that there is a certain level of seriousness, acuity, the nature of the reaction to this should be understood, and you should try to have a venue for controlling everything from the anxiousness and anxiety around this to moving forward and how the support should be there relative to the people who are being tasked with resolution. It's always important to garner support for what's being dealt with, and that can only happen if there is an atmosphere that is clearly a two-way condition, not a senior inferior condition, or one that is very stressful, or one that is even one way relative to understanding the process. So it's important for giving the ability for a person to know when it's necessary to garner support around how to deal with this. You could get feedback from an individual saying, this isn't moving fast enough, or I'm not feeling the depth of understanding in my ability to deal with this, or I have a team member who's basically sitting on their part of this process. Do I move that task, or do I deal with the person at hand to help them to make it happen? So the task may include, once the CAPA is open, how it's initiated for actions. To really understand, it must have a true root cause analysis. That analysis should be a process that is not biased in any way relative to the information that is used, and it will properly determine as its outcome the task to be rendered. It's important to think through actions that will need to be taken in terms of cause and effect relationships. This is so important because it's very important to understand in decision making and assignments how people deal with these things. Are they going to be fully consensus driven? Are they going to be consensus driven at face value and go off and do their own thing, or are they simply going to torpedo this thing altogether and do what it is they want to do? This needs to be very open communication when it comes to understanding who takes what actions and what needs to be done when, and then how it's verified. Okay? Of course, you want to assign the task in some form of a format that allows you for tracking the mechanism actively and not randomly. Tasks tie into the statement of cause or statement of the support of the action on the basis of the root cause or the conditions that verify that the actions need to be taken. Each CAPA could actually become its own mini project, and actually even within a mini project, let's say that there's validation activity required relative to verification, but while doing that, the expanse or the scope of that may not necessarily need a formal validation project. You may instigate a change control as a validation opportunity, and the change control itself becomes the venue for a validation project if it has the information that needs to be gathered in there to push through to verification of the actions taken for effectiveness. Management review. With regard to management review reporting, first of all, I'm going to say this and have you, if you kind of noodle through this and understand, management review can be in itself a culprit relative to why activities and conditions are the way they are. Okay, so it is important in the venue of how you report to management review that you are clear, honest, effective, and that those three things bring about very important candor with the management team so that they can really effectively take measures to support what it is you're doing. So during the reporting back, whether it be in the CAPAs or CAP process, it's very important for management to get a secondary escalation of reporting relative to the project management that is occurring on a regular basis. So one of the ways to help that is to have singular level one-page project management conditions so that you're going through from the highest level to each sub-level across to each sub-level for that, so that people can look at a document at their appropriate level and understand what they need to do to move through looking at the criteria and any decisions that need to be made to help affect closure. The project leader or response team leader. These people need to be from a technical mode, the ability to translate to cause and effect relationships in a systematic fashion to a member of the executive team, like the director of quality. And so it's important for that, at that level, to have that communication and be able to take the technical aspects collectively of what's being done, translate it to the executive team member, and then have that team member report into management review. Proposed reports reviewed for sign-off. First of all, make sure the appropriate people are signing off. Don't give any indication in the venue for how people sign off, review, and report that they are not in a position that would compromise the project, because they should not be a person signing at the appropriate level versus should be assigning the document at the appropriate level. Give explanations for actions that may be taken beyond the schedule. A good way to do that, again, is to have a reporting document as a project management document, a single page that shows a sliding timeline condition across a calendar with the appropriate break, whether it be in weeks or months or et cetera. And then in that a sliding condition that shows where you are, okay, and what's being done, and then drops down to say, this one's not done based on a risk, and here is the risk, and here's how it's going to be resolved. So basically what I'm saying is use a risk-based approach to a sliding method around your calendar to show what will be done if, in fact, there was a risk and you did manage it. Try to be concise about keeping as your goal the findings to the resolution around what was said in the 483. It's nice to have a finding or a 483 where you're like, oh, we're doing all these other things to make sure that that's supported. No, what you want to do is to try to be concise. But be concise to the extent that you're not leaving a hole or set of holes in what it is you're trying to do, that you think that the FDA may come back and say, well, shouldn't you have done a CAPA to support this? Shouldn't you have done a validation to support this? You know, minimize the verbiage, but make sure you're plugging the holes in the dam. So the resource team. What does the resource team look like? Okay, we're talking about a responsibility matrix to show who fulfills what roles and responsibilities. Okay, these roles and responsibilities should be working the action items within either a correction or a corrective action, preventive action approach. Make sure that the internal reporting is there. Have a project planned orientation email venue that says, when I report this, I report directly to so-and-so and so-and-so, and I make sure that the information carries through to these appropriate CC people for information purposes, okay? Communication is absolutely imperative. Make sure that management reviews are occurring at the appropriate times, at the appropriate place and times in the project. So in terms of resources, when we start to open these action conditions as corrections or corrective actions, the response team needs to think in terms of its resources as to how it's going to do things. If, for instance, you're in a production orientation for a 483, and the best way to do that is that you have chosen one or two different product lines to effectively gather objective evidence. Within those product lines, make sure that those people who are performing and have a cause and effect relationship with those lines are aware of what you're doing, okay? And that you can educate them and train them in a way that they can show the effectiveness, because one of the things that's very difficult is when you've run the project all the way through and after monitoring for effectiveness, you don't have the ability to show trends or variations in the data that support that. The timelines promised to the FDA really do count. It's important for you to keep those timelines. If you have, say, a set of action items for completion for objective evidence for closure, and one of them is going to fall out because it needs another 3 months or 2 months or whatever, give explanation to that, but keep the timeline for the reporting on that item. Resources must understand the importance of the timely actions, as I just covered earlier in the example I gave relative to the manufacturing area. whoever you need to extend training and awareness to within the areas where these things are affected, you should consider that as part of your plan. And of course, ensure all appropriate action items have been completed relative to the corrective action or CAP process. If an owner of an action item is assigned, they should be the person who most understands the resource requirements and to fulfill those resource requirements, and to report upward if there are any issues with that relative to the project management venue or document. And then think long and hard about which resources to assign to which items. This is a planning issue. As a matter of fact, it should be a formal planning issue. There should be a plan analysis worksheet or document that is used. And in that document, there are 3 key things that need to be included. First is the responsibility matrix itself relative to either the items or the process steps that you're looking at. Second should be the looking at problems by problem statements or opportunities by opportunity statements, and then giving some risk evaluation around each one of those, positive or negative, relative to the condition under which you're going to take actions. The next item, root cause, and then the final being a set of actions related to each other, and maybe even some triggers so that you have thought through the point at which you're looking at those items that could make it apparent that you need to take action. Internal management reporting. Make sure you understand the CAPA owners it's paramount that they be in the know and be in the loop. How is that relationship to the CAPA owner to the project leader, and the responsibilities about making sure these things are occurring on a timely basis? The report to management review should be concise, and what we mean by that is high-level elements for sub-objectives to main objectives. And then, are we being successful in our alignment with those relative to the criteria? Management must determine information and have an agreement in the sign-off of that information provided to the FDA, whether it be something that's good, bad, or ugly. It still needs to get to the FDA, and management just simply needs to be aware and understand why. Ensure commitments to report and that those reports are maintained. So in terms of the resource team, who should the reporting to the FDA consist of? Okay, that depends upon how often the reporting will be done, what type of report format may be used, and in that format, am I expecting potentially an additional letter from the FDA? What are the risks relative to understanding that reporting mechanism, and make sure that the report is risk-based. Be sure that the comments, the venue of the comments, be able to show why you are prioritizing certain things in terms of resources, timing, availability, maybe in terms of what product may or may not be running every other month or every other week, and how you have to adjust for that. Okay. Who should be signing off on the report? Okay. The report may be designated in a large organization to be signed off by an executive manager at the director level, or it may be something where the preference is to review this thing upward in management review to the highest executive level for sign-off. Should I provide updates? It's not required, but like anything else in any other venue, giving some feedback keeps the folks at the FDA, helps them to avoid having to make inquiry when they don't need to. Worst case is they're not hearing from you, so guess what? They're going to get in their car, they're going to drive down there and say, hey, I'm here to perform a follow-up on 483s, 1, 2, 9, 7, 11, and we'll be doing that investigation today unannounced. Depends on policy and seriousness of the findings as to what and how much should be given in terms of the feedback to the findings. Very, very risk-based. Maintain that relationship. Monthly and quarterly may even be appropriate as you go through the process. If I'm an organization clearly that has a resource deficiency, and the FDA is basically saying to me, you simply don't have the resources to organizationally perform this. That would be something, for instance, that creates a significant risk, and I would want to show how I manage that in terms of an ongoing relationship relative to data or information. And, of course, understanding that it may take time to do certain things to make decisions around organization, how you're going to change to be effective. Okay, so that should be reflected in your plan. There doesn't necessarily need to be a specific media or venue for the reporting format. Provide company letterhead when appropriate relative to the evidence that may be attached for follow-up or an update to the FDA. And of course, management of some form should sign showing commitment, at least at some form of the executive level of the organization. Okay, so resolution and verification for effectiveness. How do we know when a resolution is complete? First of all, it needs to be in alignment of what the reporting is to what the project expectations are. And so those two should be just about every time, if not every time, should be related to each other in the reporting mechanism. How you conduct the assessment in terms of monitoring, auditing validation condition. Is the validation condition going to be done internally or externally in terms of resources and commitment so that you don't have any bias? Those kind of things. Results, of course, to the project based on the tasks that are driven, and the outcome that is expected may be given a data analysis format based on the criteria that have been formulated. Excuse me. And the endpoint should then reflect conclusively based on whatever those validated outcomes are, including the level of control for risk as part of that. Now, there are two sides to any piece of information that you look at in order to perform verification of effectiveness. The easy one is that you have criteria for which you have developed specifications. And will the range of data in terms of a variable data format work within the confines of that of those specifications or criteria? And if not, is there a statistical way to show improvement or the nature of condition under which that data is controlled? Is it binomial? Is it a Six Sigma under a normal curve? One of the things I really get a kick out of is what's called assumptive normality, which is that an organization says, well, you know, this part of our process is under control all the time, so it's a normal distribution of data. Well, how do you know that? Where's the data? Where's the data? Okay. Now the other side of this is the attribute conditions under which a resolution occurs, which are typically not looked at, but are considered. A lot of organizations will take what I refer to as soft conditions for understanding that you really are reaching resolution, but those soft conditions haven't been given enough operational definition as an attribute where you can actually throw data at that and say, you know what, we have conclusively moved the level at which this should be occurring to almost zero on the basis of our original data and the tail of that data in showing us how we're doing. Are there shoulders in that attribute data? The key there, of course, being with an attribute under a binomial condition is that the best case scenario is zero. Measure for effectiveness. So what do I measure? Do I measure a variable? Do I measure an attribute? How do I define that attribute? Is the variable under which I'm looking at the data normal before I start to determine whether I'm being effective? Okay. So what I'm talking about here in the lean sense is to consider what we refer to as clear operational definition of process attributes and variables, okay? Potentially look at scatter data where you're understanding relationships of variables that may become more statistically, they've always been in place and been either direct or opposite or inverse, but the key is where the data relates to that condition and how closely that data relates statistically to make it more predictable, okay? How long shall I continue? Well, that really depends upon data span on the basis of those attributes that affect that process. You know, are there seasonal effects that have created this issue? Are there demographic effects that have created this issue? Are there supplier turnover relative to seasonal lot product that has created this issue? You have to look at those things that create the conditions under which those attributes or variables will change and or be affected. In terms of measures, this should not be an issue if the process control condition verification is shown to be in place. What I mean by that is, for instance, a revalidation effort may be required here. That would be worst case scenario, is that you actually are saying our data is telling us that, that we don't have good process validation and we must revalidate our process. And the root cause relative to what has instigated that re-verification is based on the analysis and now the actions to be taken through the CAPA. Again, use attribute data as well as available variable data, and of course, the more sizable the database, the better. But make sure the database is effective in its management. You may be collecting data every 15 minutes when data collected once an hour and 15 minutes, or 15 minutes, whatever that magic number is. You should conclude the effectiveness of the amount and the nature of that measure before you start actually performing the collective analysis of the data. So how and who do I engage for serious findings? The resources to be identified, of course, are relative to the depth of potentially internal or external conditions relative to the seriousness of the finding. Okay, so a fairly obvious one would be if a change has been controlled, a change has been made but not controlled for an external supplier. A contractor who has come in to perform what would be standardized conditions relative to a piece of equipment or line of equipment, and what were the standards used for that purpose? Was the appropriate data collected to verify that those standards were met? The importance of having a resource understand the theory and the practical nature of the fix. So sometimes when we say fix, it's not something that can be either seen by the naked eye or be in any way, shape, or form have the ability to be sensed in terms of the bodily senses we know of, and that the technology must be there in order for the level of detection to occur. So here's that ongoing battle we know about understanding when we deal with risk, talking about the third component of risk, which is occurrence, seriousness, and detection relative to the importance of understanding what may be the complex nature of the fix relative to the resources to be used to understand it. Should also have, and to follow on to my point that I just made, should also have very good critical thinking skills to help guide the client in their endeavor to move to a point where they can show from a thinking pattern, from a thinking standpoint, how they were actually able to assess effectiveness. And that comes through whether it be in terms of a critical thinking skill under root cause, risk-based decision making, risk-based plan analysis, risk-based issue review. All of these processes need to have calibrated critical thinking associated with them. Project management, of course, is a must to complement the technical level and support relative to resolution. How about from a legal standpoint? Well, there obviously may be the need for potential legal assistance, and again, risk is commensurate to this. If you see that you have a risk condition where there will be some significant competition for internal resources for legal counsel relative to timing for the project, you may want to say, hey, we need to have an external resource for legal assistance in order to keep up with the project and not impede its ability to meet its timeline. Most credible resources have and associate with firms or specialists in that regard that I've just described. And good relationships with the agency and the personnel in resolving the issues as a removed party for verification that you're moving along appropriately. Firms are available with good relations with an agency. I worked with a warning letter condition for a product in the nutraceutical industry. It was a product that was very shelf life sensitive, very sensitive in terms of level of the condition of which the product was operating to be effective in the flora of the human being. But more importantly, what we did was we looked for a legal organization that had a good relationship with the FDA and clearly could translate and understand what it was doing and why we were doing it, and have the appropriate communication mustered between the DOJ on the regulatory side, the law firm representing the private sector side, and how to translate through that those things that were important to understand. Avoid kind of a smoking gun attitude if a relationship, is especially if a relationship is absolutely necessary. So avoid any adversarial conditions under which things may happen. And one of the ways in which that unfortunately occurs is where people, in their intent from both ends to get to resolution, agree violently about how to get there. And what I mean by that is have a common language. Critical thinking provides a good common language for making sure that you're speaking on the same terms at the same level relative to risk, relative to information. So avoid an adversarial condition by making sure you can clearly understand and attempt to explain the nature or the knowledge around what it is you're doing and why. So what happens if we have a rebound now? We have the FDA's going to decide that they want to come back in for a visit. What kind of visit can we expect, okay? There are usually cycles under which these visitations occur based on risk. Typically 2 to 3 year cycles is the case. But again, be aware that anything you do within the project to identify that there may be significant risk is going to have everything to do with how they rebound, okay? Again, the risk-based approach, as I mentioned. Follow-up. These are and can be avoided with good communication. It's so important to instigate a clear cycle for the points at which you want to make sure they understand what it is you're doing and why. And be a little bit sensitive to understanding that the FDA, they have competition in time and conditions under which they're operating, and be sensitive to their needs relative to how much information and when you give that information. Follow-ups again will be risk oriented, and when the flag goes up, the flag may go up externally in your world or your industry sector, or some conditions under which your product has been exposed out in the public realm, in the patient realm. That may bring about a visit to you, even though you have done things appropriately. So good structure and good content should be available to the follow-up, making sure that your records are in order, having a good quality assurance process associated with that, and making sure that, more importantly, making sure you're using the process. You're not sidestepping it, you're not condensing it, you're not expediting it, that you're doing the things to which you've said you will do. Okay? And of course, making sure improvement is good in terms of the expectation or rationale around that improvement. Resource commitments, again, should continue to be commensurate with the time frame in which you're doing what you're doing and they're coming back for the investigation. Risk-based. Communication may be one way, but continue to communicate anyway. Do whatever it takes. And of course, the for cause audit, it's interesting, a for cause audit may be something that comes through the FDA where an infraction occurs relative to adulterated or poor product. You are a supplier to that product. You become now a string of events which take place in the investigation for that supply material chain. When the FDA comes in, or for that matter, any of the agencies come in for that purpose, they may first look at the for cause condition relative to lot-specific conditions and so forth, but they may also broaden that for cause if they sense that your system is at risk. Okay, so summary. In summary, some key points for consideration. Good project management. Make sure that you have, first of all, people who understand what that means, and secondly, a venue or document, like I mentioned, the OPPM document or one-page project manager, as a venue for making that happen, especially to meet timeline commitments. Make sure that the analysis is formidable enough for the infraction relative to content. Good critical thinking skills, including the use of empirical data, not just inferable data, or taking inference upon, putting it upon formal data, and making some conjecture as opposed to a realistic and true sense of the word in terms of your ability to verify closure. Okay, clarification of issues in terms of urgency and impact. That should be a driver for understanding where you are and expediting the critical thinking side of this. You may not need a root cause analysis if you determine through clarification that alternatives relative to those criteria have been developed. So don't become process driven to the point where you don't have the ability to assess where you are in actually creating closure in terms of the actions for the process of verification. Of course, use root cause process with verification of root causes so that you are not having to, based on risk, continue this cycle of trying to bring closure. I know most organizations don't have that happen to them where an issue comes up again, but if you were to have the issue come up again, it's important that through root cause verification you have the ability to resolve that effectively. Okay. Criteria and risk-based decision making. In that process, of course, all of this is objective driven. And so the important thing to recognize here is, how do you translate the objective to those criteria by which you're going to make risk-based decisions? If you do that in the critical thinking aspect of things, you'll be successful. Okay. Plan and plan analysis. It's great to have a plan. It's great to execute that plan, but don't shoot yourself in the foot because you haven't done some form of, say, critical area or condition analysis where you know there may be risk and you're planning for those risks, okay? And of course, in terms of what we call innovative operations, understanding improvement innovation, where you truly are looking at risk and opportunities in a balance so that preventive action conditions or control measures are important before an event as to taking measures to mitigate after an event. Show the use of the system in addressing issues. Make sure that your CAPA process as it relates to the interrelationship of non-conforming conditions, deviations, suppliers, audits, all these things are interconnected, and you can show how they work effectively together. And of course, overall, that the regulatory body, FDA, gets a sense that you truly have integrated processes in a systematic approach. And that's my presentation for today. Thank you. And at this point, if we want to turn it over to a little Q&A, if you have any questions. Otherwise, we will have a place on our website for you to also entertain any questions with us, in which we will reply directly to those questions via email for the purpose of you having resolution around your concerns in what we've just discussed. So thank you very much.